That's better. Thank you. Good morning. Committee come to order. And now, before we begin today of this oversight hearing, I want to welcome back Army Master Sergeant Matt Reel, the majority's full committee staff director, back from a lengthy deployment overseas. So thank you, Matt, for your continued service to this nation, and welcome back. I also want to announce that Mr. Parker Chapman, the staff director of Subcommittee on Oversight and Investigations, is leaving the committee. I'm wishing him well. I wish he wasn't, but he is. He's moving on. And Parker's been a valued member of this committee for nearly 6 years. He's worked for at least 3 different subcommittees, and I'll miss his thoughtful and wise counsel. I wish him well in all of his endeavors as he moves on, as people do around here, and wish him the best. So thank you for your service. Appreciate it. I also want to welcome our witnesses today's hearing. I will have to leave the hearing at some point to mark up one of my bills in another committee, and I apologize for having to step away like that. But I would like to start by again thanking the VA staff for the incredible work they did during the pandemic. Today, we are here to review how the Department of Veterans Affairs used nearly $37 billion Congress provided in supplemental funding during the pandemic. Now that we are at the end of the pandemic emergency, it is time to look back at how well or poorly the VA handled the money. The funding spanned 3 bills. The Families First Coronavirus Response Act provided about the first $60 million. Then the CARES Act provided $19.6 billion. And finally, the American Rescue Plan Act provided another $17 billion. While Families First was a bipartisan and the CARES Act was nearly unanimous, the AARP was jammed through on party line. The rules placed on the VA for spending these funds got looser and looser and looser each time bills passed. By the time we got to the AARP, it looked like a lot like a slush fund. From the beginning, I was concerned that VA would struggle to account for the money that they'd spent and did it correctly. I wrote more than a few letters about it. Ranking Member Takano and I also introduced the VA Transparency and Trust Act to require VA to report to Congress on how this money was being spent, which later became law. We were right in our concerns. Inspector General released an audit of the CARES Act a few weeks ago. We all know the VA outdated fiscal system barely functions under normal circumstances, and the huge influx of COVID money only made things worse. More often than not, VA failed to document why they were transferring the dollars from one account to another, but the problems cannot be blamed entirely on the old system. Despite only looking at the small number of medical centers, OIG estimates that the VA failed to follow its own internal controls in over 10,000 supply purchases and service contracts. Those transactions were worth $187 million, and the Inspector General questioned the transactions for fraud and waste. But the problems go well beyond this one report. I request more information on the categories that the VA spent the COVID money on, and some of them make sense, but it is hard to see how others relate to COVID. Now, what I'm talking about are things like garage maintenance, pest management, libraries, and visiting directors' offices. VA regular budget should easily be paying for these things. We have not seen an audit of the AARP spending yet. Congress put even fewer guardrails on the AARP money than the CARES money, so that audit may be troubling. Even though these funds were specifically for COVID, there were very little rhyme or reason for how the VA spent the money. One office used it a certain way, and the next office did it a different way. Most of the money went toward regular operations or projects that would have happened anyway. Particularly, no one could tell the difference between a COVID supplemental dollar or a regular dollar. VA saw them like these $2, identical dollars that could be spent whatever, however, whenever they wanted. Now, the problem with that is when somebody asks for a ransom, they ask for dollars in unmarked bills. Now, unfortunately, that's kind of what we did. We gave you dollars in unmarked bills, and now we're trying to figure out what you did with those unmarked bills. I'm concerned that the VA is getting dependent on these one-time supplementals from Congress. We need to provide the veterans care and benefits in regard to the budget and oversee that money to ensure that vet services are going to the veterans and they serve them well. That is exactly what the Republicans on the Appropriations Committee did last week. They advanced a bill that fully funds at exactly the level that President Biden requested. Let me say that again. They advanced a bill that fully funds VA at exactly the level that President Biden requested. The only difference is they put about $15 billion in VA's regular health care accounts rather than putting everything in the Toxic Exposure Fund. But the scare tactics from the other side of the aisle over the last few weeks about a 22% cut have not stopped. We kept our word, and the numbers do not lie. Now, I want you to look at the chart we have behind us here. Here were the requests for each of the last 3 fiscal years, and I want you to look where we were at and where we funded, and tell me, does any of it look like we cut to you? Can anybody look at that and say we cut? Republicans are counting on being fully funding VA in addition to the billions of dollars of COVID money. We've kept our word. Now it's time to put the partisan bickering and the partisan showboating to the side. It is not helping anyone, and it is not what we were sent here to do. Ranking Member Takano and I recognize you I recognize you now for your opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm glad you recognized me.
You look just like you did yesterday.
Thank you. And I appreciate that you gave recognition of the fact that my staff director, Matt Reel, is back from a long deployment. And I'm looking forward to one of my staffers, Chris Bennett, who's also been away on leave, who's been on a deployment. And ironically, Chris Bennett was Matt Reel's commanding officer.
They just kick it away.
And it just kind of brings to mind that we have taken USERRA, the USERRA law seriously, that we held open as per law their right to return to their jobs back from the deployment. Mr. Chairman, I just wish that we could work together to make sure that USERRA works for every service member and every reservist, and that we do away with the, I'm trying to think of the term that is used. Anyway, there's no private right of action. If employers have forced arbitration, if there's a forced arbitration clause in their employment contract, service members have returned and not been able to get those jobs because they haven't been able to get their case into court because of these forced arbitration clauses. I would hope on a bipartisan basis that we can work together to make sure that no one who goes on a deployment who's a reservist cannot come back to their job, as we have said in law should be the case. Now, as for my opening statement, during the great influenza epidemic, more than 100 years ago, it is estimated that 50 million people died worldwide due to the lack of pharmaceutical interventions. A century later, the world was in the grip of another global pandemic that caused significant fear and great uncertainty in the early days. Thankfully, in that time, science and medicine advanced considerably. In fact, within a year of identifying the SARS-CoV-2, scientists had developed several vaccines. The supplemental funds provided to VA during the COVID-19 pandemic supported the department's ability to respond heroically to a global public health disaster. VA not only sustained its own capacity to provide care to veterans and prevent the spread of the virus among its workforce, but it also provided critical care to civilians as it served as the backdrop to the American healthcare system in more than one part of the country. More than 6,000 VHA employees volunteered to deploy to assist civilian and tribal health systems. And during the course of the pandemic, these funds allowed VA to care for more than 750,000 veterans, vaccinate more than 4.5 million veterans, and another 130,000 veteran caregivers, family members, and dependents, and provide well over 1 million pieces of personal protective equipment and conduct over 900 research projects. And while these actions were in response to the very real emergency this country faced, the silver lining in this work can also help us better prepare for the next global pandemic. Last December, I convened a full committee hearing on VA's pandemic response. We received testimony from Dr. Richard Stone, who was chiefly responsible for implementing the supplemental funds Congress provided to the Veterans Health Administration. In his book, Save Every Life You Can, he spoke at length about the importance of working relationships and how critical they were in VA receiving the resources and authorities it needed during the pandemic. So I ask unanimous consent to add an excerpt from his book highlighting the importance of the emergency supplemental funding Congress provided.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And with the funding and flexibilities Congress authorized during the pandemic, VA reduced veteran homelessness by 11%, the largest drop in the point-in-time count we have seen in years. VA used these supplemental funds to bring veterans indoors and provide them with basic needs like clothing and food. Funding was used to place veterans in hotels and motels to lessen the risk of COVID-19 transmission that vulnerable veterans would otherwise face in congregate shelters, the streets, or homeless encampments. VA was also able to innovate and implement new programs that have proven successful in preventing housing insecurity, like shallow subsidies. The pandemic served as a test case for what VA can do with more funding and more flexibility to address the homeless crisis. VA showed us that they can use that funding to get veterans the care and housing they need. VA showed us how to end veteran homelessness. I look forward to continuing to work with my colleagues to ensure that VA maintains this funding and tools in pursuit of our shared goal of a place to call home for every veteran who has served our country. Now, on the VBA front, VA also seamlessly pivoted using the authorities granted by Congress to allow hundreds of thousands of student veterans to continue their educational pursuits in the face of an unprecedented health crisis. VA also administered the Veteran Rapid Retraining Assistance Program using $386 million appropriated by Congress in a truly bipartisan effort to train over 13,000 veterans who lost their job due to COVID-19 for new employment. And while the program had a rocky start, I look forward to hearing more from VA on the results. The appropriation of emergency funds to VA saved countless lives and supported care for veterans. And at the same time, we must never forget that the COVID-19 pandemic took more than 1.1 million lives in the United States, including 23,507 veterans and 259 VA employees. This unprecedented crisis called for a major infusion of funds, and Congress delivered by providing $36.7 billion in emergency funding for VA. However, a recent report from the Inspector General revealed a number of administrative flaws in tracking those funds. VA's financial management system is 30 years old and is difficult to maintain and adapt to emergency requirements like those presented during the pandemic. The Inspector General found that because of the current system's inability to directly obligate supplemental funds, manual expenditure transfers were used to move funds across VA. The Inspector General found that the use of manual transfers limited transparency and accountability of employee payroll and other contractual services and medical supply purchases. Further, VA's Office of Finance did not follow established policy and develop guidance for documentation to create an audit trail. Now, I realize that during the pandemic, things were stressful for all employees at VA and that everyone was doing the best they could to procure supplies and contract for support. But this does not, however, absolve VHMA management from providing basic guidance to account for those funds. Now, I'm appalled to see the extent of the issue discovered by the Inspector General. The lack of accountability and transparency that can be provided to auditors and to Congress as a result of this failure damages VA's credibility and invites questions about the extent of potential waste, fraud, and abuse. Now, I wish we could have used this hearing to focus on the good that VA has done for employees and veterans during the pandemic, but this does cast a shadow over those efforts. This once again highlights the desperate need for the modernization of IT systems at VA. And the Financial Management Business Transformation Program is intended to provide that solution. But the pace of the rollout and the issues with integration and adoption within VHA has not given our committee confidence. As a result, this Congress, I introduced H.R. 1659, the IT Modernization Improvement Act. My legislation will require independent verification and validation of large IT programs, including the Financial Management and Business Transformation Program. And because of how important this program is and the impact that delays are having on the ability to manage and audit finances at VA, this bill has been included in the recent EHR Reset Act that I've co-sponsored with Chairman Boss, and he mentioned that in his opening comments. I appreciate that this is something that we can work on together in a bipartisan manner and help get this and other large IT projects on track. I look forward to hearing from the witnesses today to talk about both the good and the bad. We provide necessary funding and entrust VA to serve our veterans and ensure they are provided with care and benefits that they have earned. The administrative and financial management of this department must evolve and rise to this challenge, and it's time for VA to step up, admit mistakes, and make changes. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Ranking Member Takano. We will now turn to our witnesses testifying before us today. We have Mr. John Ryszalski, the Assistant Secretary of Management and Chief Financial Officer of the Department of Veterans Affairs. He is accompanied by Ms. Laura Duke, Chief Financial Officer of the Veterans Health Administration, and Mr. Robert McDivitt, Director of the VISN 23 of the Veterans Health Administration. We also have the Honorable Mike Missel, Inspector General for the Department of Veterans Affairs, and Ms. Whitney Bell, President of the National Association of State Veterans Homes. If you wouldn't mind, the witnesses would please stand and raise their right hand. Do you solemnly swear that the testimony you are about to provide is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? Thank you, and let the record reflect that the witnesses answered in the affirmative. Mr. Ryszalski, I now recognize you for 5 minutes for your opening statement.
Good morning, Chairman Boss, Ranking Member Takano, and members of the committee. Thank you for this opportunity to discuss how the Department of Veterans Affairs' use of supplemental funds enabled us to meet the challenges of the COVID-19 pandemic by providing essential care and benefits to our nation's veterans during this unprecedented public health crisis. I'm John Ryszalski, Assistant Secretary for Management and Chief Financial Officer of the VA. Joining me today are my colleagues Laura Duke, who's been introduced, and also Robert McDivitt from VISN 23. I want to thank Congress for their support of the VA and, more importantly, for their support of the veterans we serve. An excellent example of this is the $36.7 billion Congress provided in supplemental funding outside of our annual appropriation. With the resources from 3 COVID-19 relief laws provided at a time when the pandemic's path, duration, and impact were unclear, VA responded with tremendous effort to maintain health care and benefit services while protecting the lives of veterans, their families, and VA personnel. Our staff worked heroically and at great personal risk throughout the pandemic to provide services and benefits to those whom we owe so much, and we're grateful for the courageous dedication of VA personnel in providing care and benefits to veterans throughout this difficult time. The critical role played by the supplemental funds provided by Congress cannot be overstated. Between March 2020 and the end of the public health emergency, VA provided more than 332 million health care appointments to all veterans via in-person visits, community care visits, telehealth visits, and more, the most appointments for such a time frame in VA history. This included caring for more than 870,000 veterans with COVID-19 and admitting nearly 700 U.S. non-veteran citizens for care at VA medical centers. In addition, VHA accepted 196 mission assignments from the Federal Emergency Management Agency. VA vaccinated more than 4.5 million veterans, 320,000 employees, and 130,000 veteran caregivers, family members, and dependents. VA also gave booster shots to more than 2.3 million veterans. COVID-19 supplemental funds enabled VA to hire over 136,000 new clinical and administrative staff between 2020 and 2022. This occurred during one of the most challenging labor markets in history, especially in the medical community. As a result of our financial flexibility during the pandemic, today the VA enjoys one of its strongest staffing levels in many years. With the supplemental funds, we provided emergency housing and supportive services for veterans who needed to be isolated for their safety or the safety of others. Supportive services for veteran families placed over 23,000 vulnerable veterans in hotels or motels to reduce their risk of exposure. There were also over 18,000 emergency housing placements. More than 77,000 technology devices were made available for distribution to homeless or at-risk veterans to help them stay engaged with healthcare providers and support systems when face-to-face visits were not an option. The supplemental funds allowed the VA's geriatrics and extended care services to distribute $350 million in one-time payments to state extended care facilities for COVID-19 related expenditures and operational costs. Some used these funds for nurse retention grant requests from states, which increased 1,250% during the pandemic. $500 million of supplemental funding was designated to provide grants through the current capital grant program for construction of state veteran homes. With that extra $500 million, we were able to fund a total of 34 additional projects. $150 million was designated for grants for capital needs to modify state veteran home buildings to respond to COVID-19. We also waived the required 35% of matching funds by the state. These funds enabled us to meet the pandemic's many challenges, and we have worked to manage the resources entrusted to us responsibly. The IG and GAO have each conducted extensive oversight of VA's execution of the COVID-19 relief funding. We appreciate their work, and VA has accepted all findings and has closed some recommendations and is working through action plans to address the remainder. The IG's findings identified long-standing issues that we have been aware of and have been well documented in our financial statement audit. We have been working for several years to address them by implementing a modern financial and acquisition system, consolidating accounting and payroll functions at our Financial Services Center, and greatly improving training of our financial workforce. We are seeing positive results from these efforts. The VA has maintained 24 clean financial statement audit opinions that cover all funding sources, including these supplemental funds. And as recognized by the Government Accountability Office in March 2023, VA has reduced overall improper payments by 76% and reported its lowest rate of improper payments in 8 years. Let me say that again. There'll be a report coming out this week in which we're reporting our lowest rate of improper payments in 8 years. The financial statement audit and the improper payment testing are both overseen by the IG. VA is proud of the role we played in the federal response to the pandemic, which touched every part of VA's operations. In particular, our response to COVID-19 demonstrated the strength and agility of an integrated healthcare system that was provided the resources needed to accomplish its mission. Again, I thank you for the opportunity to testify today and would be happy to answer any questions that you have. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Rashowski. And I now recognize Mr. Missel. I would recognize you for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Chairman Boss, Ranking Member Takano, and members of the committee. I appreciate the opportunity to discuss the OIG's oversight of VA's use of COVID-19 supplemental funds. The COVID-19 pandemic significantly altered the way VA provided services and benefits to veterans and their families. The OIG recognizes that VA staff worked tirelessly throughout the pandemic, often at significant risk and sacrifice. I would also like to thank the OIG staff who seamlessly continued our oversight work during these last 3 years. The additional funding that Congress provided us ensured that we could quickly adapt to these unprecedented times. We pivoted not only to our customary oversight work, but also published over 40 pandemic-related reports and investigated dozens of COVID-related criminal matters. In response to the pandemic, Congress provided VA with more than $36 billion in supplemental funding. The OIG has published 5 reports in the last 2 years related to this funding. We found that VA generally complied with the Transparency and Trust Act of 2021, which requires VA to provide to Congress a detailed plan outlining its intent for obligating and expending funds covered by the Act. However, we made 2 recommendations for VA to improve the quality and sufficiency of information reported to Congress. In our report published this month, we found that VHA lacked general controls over its medical facilities' use of CARES Act funds. We also estimated that over 10,000 COVID-19 related transactions that were directly obligated from the CARES Act fund were non-compliant with key fiscal controls, resulting in the OIG questioning costs totaling an estimated $187 million. These deficiencies were due in part to VA's outdated financial management system. VA is currently implementing a new financial management system, IFAMS, which may be able to resolve some of these issues. However, VA does not expect a fully automated solution in this decade. Another challenge VA faces is its decentralized financial management structure. The CFOs of VHA, VBA, and NCA do not report to Mr. Richalski, the VA CFO. Also, the CFOs at VISNs and medical centers do not report to Ms. Duke, the VHA CFO. This structure has been a material weakness or significant deficiency for many years in our audits of VA's consolidated financial statements. In addition to our oversight of pandemic-related funding, we performed audits and inspections of numerous other programs and issues related to COVID-19. These include VHA's efforts to expand telehealth, the failure to adequately track and reschedule millions of canceled appointments, and inspections of medical facilities' pandemic readiness. Moreover, our criminal investigators brought numerous COVID-related criminal cases, including one in which an individual attempted to obtain orders from VA for over $800 million of non-existent personal protective equipment. When I testified before this committee in February, I noted that a recurring theme about the deficiencies we identified in VA's programs centered on accountability. Our COVID-19 related reports had similar deficiencies in several critical areas of accountability, such as the need for strong governance, adequate staffing, updated IT systems, quality assurance, and stable and effective leadership. COVID-19 posed considerable challenges to the operations of VA and its staff. We recognize that VA is working to address the issues we identified in all our pandemic-related reports. The OIG is steadfastly committed to our mission of conducting meaningful, independent oversight that will help VA improve the services and benefits that it provides. Finally, as we approach the Memorial Day observances, on behalf of the OIG, I would like to express our deep gratitude to all who gave their lives in defense of our country. Chairman Bost and members of the committee, I look forward to answering any questions that you may have.
Thank you, Mr. Mitchell. Ms. Bell, you are now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Bost, Ranking Member Takano, and members of the committee. As president of the National Association of State Veterans Homes, I am pleased to offer testimony on how COVID-19 impacted state homes and how VA supported us and the veterans we care for throughout the pandemic. My full-time job is administrator of the State Veterans Home in Fayetteville, North Carolina. However, today I am pleased to share the combined experiences, observations, and recommendations of my NASVA colleagues. As you know, the State Veterans Home Program is a partnership between the federal government and states that provide long-term residential care to aging and disabled veterans through 163 state homes located in all 50 states and Puerto Rico. With over 30,000 authorized beds, the state homes provide half of all federally supported nursing home care to veterans, and we do so with less than 20% of VA's nursing home budget. Although states own and operate the homes, VA has wide-ranging oversight authority, performing at least one comprehensive inspection annually to assure the quality of care. In addition, various state homes are also inspected and audited by VA's Inspector General, the Justice Department, CMS, as well as state and local authorities. Mr. Chairman, when the pandemic began in 2020, state homes were among the first to implement significant precautions. However, the asymptomatic nature of COVID, combined with the lack of testing, treatments, and vaccines, made it virtually impossible to prevent COVID from entering any facility or location in the country. It's important to note the veterans in state homes are significantly older than those in VA CLCs or community nursing homes, and they are more likely to be receiving end-of-life care in our homes. In addition to the devastating physical toll on veteran residents and staff, the pandemic also put tremendous financial strain on our homes. With new admissions suspended and veterans passing away from COVID and non-COVID causes, daily census levels declined, and thus VA per diem support declined significantly, even though our fixed cost stayed the same. Fortunately, soon after the pandemic began, VA responded as part of its fourth mission. For example, in North Carolina, VA provided testing and training on infection control. In Illinois and Michigan, VA provided thousands of face masks and protective gowns. In California, VA provided testing of up to 200 residents and employees weekly. And in Iowa and Idaho, VA provided direct staffing support, particularly nurses. These are just a few of the ways the VA medical centers supported state homes during the pandemic. Congress also responded quickly, and NASVA was grateful to work with this committee and its Senate counterpart to enact legislation to help mitigate some of the pandemic's impacts. The CARES Act included waivers from occupancy rates and veteran percentage requirements, and VA was also able to waive bed hold requirements. NASVA would especially like to thank this committee for helping to secure emergency supplemental funding in the American Rescue Plan and CARES Acts, which allowed the VA to provide $1 billion in supplemental funding to state veterans' homes, including $650 million for construction grants to rehabilitate and retrofit homes to increase safety for our veterans, and $350 million in direct assistance to help state homes prevent and respond to the spread of COVID. Mr. Chairman, although the public health emergency has ended, state homes continue to face significant financial challenges. In response, bipartisan legislation was recently introduced in the Senate to continue the bed hold waiver, and we would welcome companion of similar legislation in the House. NASVA is also seeking congressional support to set the basic per diem rate at 50% of the daily cost of care, fully fund the construction grant program at least $600 million in FY 2024, and enact new legislation to help state homes fill critical staffing shortages, particularly nursing. Mr. Chairman, in conclusion, NASVA greatly values our federal and state partnership, and we look forward to working with this committee to find new and innovative ways to strengthen state veterans' homes for the men and women we serve. That concludes my testimony, and I would be pleased to answer any questions you or the members of the committee may have.
Thank you, Ms. Bell, and thank all the witnesses for their testimony. We're now going to questions, and I'll recognize myself for 5 minutes. Mr. Missel, and I know you expanded on this in your testimony, but why did the VA struggle to account for CARES Act funds, and have any of the underlying problems been cured as of yet?
There are a number of different reasons why they struggled. First, they have an antiquated financial management system, FMS, that has created challenges over the years. Secondly, the governance structure of the financial management organization is really difficult because of the gaps in terms of who reports to whom, which I talked about in my opening statement. Third, policies and procedures and guidance. It's really critical that they are clear, they are complete, they are accurate. Fourth, they have to make sure that people know their roles and responsibilities. We identified a number of situations where people didn't know who was responsible for certain things. Training is also critical. They have to be properly trained to be able to do their job. And finally, with all of that, you have to make sure you have internal controls to identify and to correct any deficiencies that you may find.
Thank you. Mr. Rochalski, just how much of the American Rescue Plan money remains unobligated?
Thank you for the question. You can call me John if you want, sir. Okay. Yeah, I know that last name. I think as of yesterday, I think we're right around 500 million of ARP.
500 million.
Yep.
Okay. Have you changed your spending plan for the ARP funds since the end of the COVID?
Have not, no. You know, consistent with our 23 budget submission, I think we had communicated to Congress how we intended to use those funds. We execute every day, including with cost transfers and journal vouchers. So no, it's just been business as usual. But keep in mind, we're heading to the end of the third fiscal quarter, you know, so it is waning as we expected it would.
Well, maybe now that the pandemic is over, the justification for supplemental funds is gone. Are you struggling to manage it all? Were you struggling to manage it all along?
I'm going to ask Laura and Robert to answer that question because they really manage the funding.
Okay.
So thank you for the question.
Good morning, sir. So speaking in terms of our management of the ARP, I'll note that as you mentioned in your statement, the purpose of the ARP was a little bit broader than that provided by the CARES Act. And so to the extent that we were transparent in our congressional budget justification of how we would use ARP and base funds collectively to deliver health care to veterans throughout the year. And we've delivered health care throughout the year. As we noted, it was a higher level of care because we're still making up for the deferred care and the long-term consequences of the pandemic. We do expect that our costs will be higher in the short run and then will come back down as we've proceed in the post-pandemic period.
Okay, we have a president that said the pandemic is over. We gave you money to use for the pandemic. In the last 2 weeks, you've spent $1.5 billion of that ARP money, or the ARP money. It's over. So when does the plan change that you go back to operating on your regular funds and we actually see what we can possibly save from those funds? Rather than, I mean, that's what the American citizen is going to ask me, what my people in my district are going to ask me.
Our 2024 President's budget indicates that we fully expected to expend the ARP, and as we go forward, we are clear regarding our outstanding needs for the future, and when we have funds that we do not expect to utilize in our budget, we identify that they are available for the purposes of Congress to determine.
Okay. But if we're done, and that's a real problem that the people will see, is if we're done with this, as I said, $1.5 billion in the last 2 weeks alone. That's concerning to the taxpayers of this United States. So let me also ask this. So the Biden administration asked for $325 billion for VA, and our Appropriations Committee gave them $325 billion. Now, the only difference is the bill is whether or not it would put the money in the regular account or in the Toxic Exposed Fund. Is there anything that a dollar in the regular budget can accomplish that a dollar in the Toxic Exposed Fund can't?
So I can answer that question. So the short answer to your short answer is no, there's not. But there is one consideration, and that is if we go back to the Choice Act, we have had situations where benefits have been expanded, funding was provided, but it turned out to be inadequate based upon the demand of the new benefit. And so we had to go back to Congress a couple of times mid-cycle, which was problematic. So then with the Mission Act, there was much more, I think, scrutiny or concern over adequacy of funding. There was not a separate fund for Mission Act, but we worked with staff to sort of carve out the Mission Act costs to make sure they could track it. So come along to the PACT Act and the TEF fund, it was my understanding that was supposed to be a solution for those previous situations where there wasn't enough visibility or maybe enough funding for those benefit enhancements. So the short answer is, no, there's not a difference, but there is, I think, some rationale for how we've evolved to where we are, to where, and you know better than I do why Congress passed the TEF and all of that, but it made a lot of sense based upon my history at the VA and some of the challenges we've had in the past. When I first started, there was a lot of frustration with choice and VA coming back time and time again for additional funding in the middle of the budget year.
Thank you. My time's expired. I right now recognize Ranking Member Takano.
Hi, Mr. Rotowski, I just want to verify with you that ARP funds were not connected to the pandemic. So when they lifted the public health emergency, there was nothing in the ARP bill language that linked the two.
That's correct. The ARP funds came as sort of like general purpose funds, and we made it very clear that we were using those for healthcare like we would use our baseline funds. So it was one part of the funding equation for this year. That's correct.
And in fact, the pandemic changed significantly the spending patterns of VA, and ARP money was very helpful in getting you through some difficult moments.
More than helpful, it was critical, absolutely critical.
It was critical.
Yes, it was.
So I want to turn my attention to Ms. Bell. Ms. Bell, based on your testimony, it's clear how critical the supplemental funds and authority, flexibility, were to operate state veterans' homes across the country during the pandemic. And of course, the state veterans' homes, as opposed to the CLCs, the community living centers that are run by the VA, were the locus of some really terrible tragedies. The lack of understanding of how to deal with infection control, the antiquated facilities that you had that made for congregate living situations where the virus was spread very easily among very vulnerable patients. With the end of the public health emergency, what challenges remain for state veterans' homes?
Thank you for that question. Challenges right now we're facing are not only staffing, because you have to have people to go into these nursing programs to want to be in healthcare. We have to have people to take care of people. Without those people, we don't have a census of veterans to take care of. So at the forefront is our staffing at this time. As you talk about congregate living, a lot of facilities who are semi-private rooms in facilities help to continue the spread of COVID. That being part of the construction grant program to allow us the funds to be able to restructure and retrofit to prevent that spread in the future would help.
Well, thank you. VA currently provides a per diem payment for each veteran that covers about 30% of the cost of care, and states make up the difference. As supplemental funds from the federal government disappear and state veterans' homes return to reliance significantly on state budgets, what, if any, concerns do you or your colleagues have?
In concerns to the per diem, the cost
Yes,
of care,
as it disappears.
we would definitely recommend the per diem to go up to 50% of the cost of care.
So you actually would like to see an ongoing
Yes, please.
50% of care be covered by the federal government. You don't want to see that 30% disappear.
We cannot.
So as we start to look back at the lessons learned during the last 3 years, what kind of changes or reforms should Congress focus on to enable VA and the states to better focus resources on preventing and responding to future outbreaks in state veterans' homes and other long-term care settings that serve our most vulnerable populations?
NASVA and my colleagues are requesting to fully fund the State Veterans Home Construction Grant Program, increasing the basic per diem rate, enacting the legislation to strengthen the State Veterans Home programs, and faithfully implement standardized sharing agreements and Jerry-Psych.
Well, Ms. Bell, I'm sympathetic to the notion that the veterans' homes need more funding. We need to upgrade the facilities. But I'm concerned about what the role of VA should be in terms of oversight. Would you be open to VA having more oversight authority to help ensure that homes are properly staffed, appropriately staffed, and adhering to infection control standards, among other things?
We would embrace that partnership. Just as they done boots on the ground when COVID began, we did have that support from our VA Medical Center on site in our facilities, educating us. We would embrace that.
That's very important for me to hear. I thank you for that, and I thank you for that concession, because I'm really scared that we're going to lose our memory over what happened during the pandemic. The numbers of people in homes across the country, in not just state veterans' homes, but the whole industry, that's where we saw a huge chunk of our loss of human life. Supplemental funding allowed state veterans' homes to retrofit facilities to handle pandemic conditions like infection control better. What conversations have your organizations engaged in regarding the need to upgrade and review construction requirements for future homes and avoid unnecessary deaths?
There has been much investigation, research done in explaining and showing how facilities can prevent the spread within the home. It could be making those semi-private rooms private rooms, as well as incorporating the smart air systems to help filter the air to help prevent the spread through the ventilation systems. There has been numerous conversations in concerning the retrofit of facilities, construction, with engineers, with architects, to talk about safety. Private room versus semi-private room is safe.
My time is running out. I wish we could spend more. Mr. Chairman, I hope we can work together on this oversight piece. I really feel that we can't forget just the numbers of deaths we had in these state veterans homes. But I also believe, and I'm open to the idea that we fund you better, but we've got to have more oversight. I yield back.
Thank you. Dr. Miller-Meeks, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Missel, one example in your report on page 10 is a medical $35. The supporting documents they gave you were actually submitted for a different transfer that was previously approved. Basically, they tried to submit the same receipts twice. Your office could not conclude what was purchased, why it was purchased, or whether anyone approved the purchase. And first of all, Mr. Missel, did anyone ever determine what was purchased?
We were never able to determine what was purchased.
And how widespread do you think this is, and have you seen anything like this during your tenure?
We found numerous examples where transactions were not properly documented. Unfortunately, we have seen that in a number of other projects that we've worked on. As I said before, there's a lot of different issues and challenges that VA has with respect to its financial management system, and this situation really highlighted those challenges.
Thank you. Mr. Rakowski, the IG estimated that 10,064 CARES Act purchases, these are purchases, not dollars, 10,064 purchases worth $187.2 million had problems. That was based on examining just 8 medical centers' purchases. Have you also audited both the CARES Act purchases and the ARP purchases? And if not, do you intend to do so after reading the OIG's report?
Thank you. Yeah, so the IG does great work. We are a close partner with them. The things they've identified are things that we've known for some time. But I want to be clear that it's not the, it's not the Wild West. This is somewhat alarmist, and let me give you some context. Things were exacerbated, there's no question, by the pandemic, and are. I mean, I would rather be here explaining to you why we don't have a receipt than why we harmed a veteran. I guess is one way to look at it. But the crux of the issue is, the accounting system is old and it requires a lot of manual processes. I mean, it's very heavily manually intensive. And so we have people of different skills, motivation levels that may or may not follow the policy. We do audit these funds in our annual financial statement audit with a public accounting firm. So these funds have been audited. They also go through our improper payments testing. And the difference here is, in the financial statement audit that lasts a year, they'll take the samples of transactions. They will find the same thing. In fact, if you look at our financial statement audit report, you'll have we have a material weakness with the exact same findings. But they frequently will go a little bit deeper to see if the core of the foundational accounting transaction is solid.
Well, it doesn't sound like that's a new issue or a new problem. You've known about your financial system. And as the chairman said, our duty is to make sure dollars, when we're appropriating record amount of dollars, so not just in COVID money, not just in ARA money, in record increases in the VA's budget the past 2 years in a row. We need to be able to account for those and do proper oversight. So, Mr. Rakowski, when did the president end the COVID-19 national emergency?
I think recently, May 11th, is that correct?
May 11th. And from the time I've been in Congress, To me, COVID expenditures should be timely, targeted, and temporary, i.e. they're related to the COVID-19 pandemic, not other expenditures that may need to be done or nice to be done. Do you know how much unspent money allocated for COVID-19 related non-recurring maintenance you have left over according to documents you sent this committee?
Are you talking about CARES Act funds or ARP funds?
COVID related.
I would have to get that for you. I think we've obligated CARES Act like 99.6%, and I think we have about $500 million of the ARP, and then I think for the Families First, it was 99.8%. But I have
1.17 billion. So let me.
Is left?
It's a lot of money. And the VA issued 41,000 iPads to veterans for virtual health care appointments. Seemed to be an appropriate expenditure. Unfortunately, only half of those were ever used for a health care appointment. So the IG has also noted that the VA has not attempted to retrieve many of those unused iPads valued at $6.3 million. Does the VA plan on getting these back if they aren't being used for a virtual appointment?
So I would have to take that. That's a little bit out of my lane. I have to take that for the record. I don't know if our other witnesses, Robert, if you have.
Yes, Congressman. I'm Rob McDivitt. I'm the Vision Director from Vision 23, so I have the great state of Iowa in my network. We're endeavoring right now. We issued over 3,000 cell phones to homeless veterans early in the pandemic so they could stay connected with healthcare and with the VA. We issued over 8,500 iPads to veterans in our very rural network and are tracking them. Not all of them have been used, and we've put a process in place to contact the veteran, make sure that they use their device, or we retrieve it. So we're endeavoring to do that, but we did put them out as quickly as possible to make sure that veterans remain connected to VA.
Yeah, I think retrieving the unused devices would be an appropriate utilization of your time. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Levin. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, General. And thank you to our witnesses. I want to thank you for all your work during the pandemic. Eliminating veteran homelessness is a key objective of mine. I know it's not going to be easy, but I commend you for the work that was done. I saw the 11% decrease in veteran homelessness between 2020 and 2022, and I know that's in part because of the increased funding and the flexibilities that Congress provided to you during the pandemic. I was glad to see in particular that SSVF used some of the funds for the shallow subsidy. And representing San Diego in the Congress, I know that our region benefited greatly from the shallow subsidy initiative to provide rental coverage for up to 2 years for very low income, extremely low income veterans, direct payments to landlords on behalf of the veteran to prevent homelessness in the first place. Was proud to host Chairman Van Orden of our subcommittee a few weeks ago in my district in Oceanside, California. And we talked to a lot of the local nonprofits who used the shallow subsidy and talked about the positive impact it had. But I'm concerned that we're not going to continue the robust funding for the shallow subsidy or for SSVF generally, and that we're going to fail to build on the progress that we've made. So, Assistant Secretary, I'll ask if you could discuss how the shallow subsidy program has helped to prevent veteran homelessness in the last few years.
So it might be a question best for Laura, but I know that they were able to help over 3,700, and I know that those grants or those payments are critical. For those that aren't familiar with the shallow subsidy, it's for a person or a family that has housing, but that is at risk of losing their housing. And so you can just imagine that it's much more efficient to keep them in their house than it is to have them go homeless and have to start again. But Laura, maybe you want to talk a little bit about this.
Yes, so as you correctly noted, the shallow subsidy program has been a success and has enabled us to reach veterans who are kind of in a cusp situation. The issue with the shallow subsidies isn't so much a funding issue as it is an authorities issue, because with the expiration of the medical emergency, we now need additional authority from Congress to be able to continue to meet veterans in this unique situation. And we've been in contact with you regarding that need and some of the other needs where we've learned from our pandemic experience ways that we can provide a higher quality of service to veterans even outside of a pandemic.
How about some of the other initiatives that were funded during the pandemic, some of the landlord incentives, the housing navigation, To the extent those aren't going to be sustained, how do you see that impacting our ability to end veteran homelessness?
Well, I think we have requested authority to continue some of those that are more promising. We continue our commitment to ending veteran homelessness in our 24 and 25 budgets. We are continuing to grow the program, recognizing that particularly economic situations continue to put more veterans at risk. So I think our commitment is sustained even beyond the end of the public health emergency.
That's good to hear, and we'll definitely keep our eyes on that. One of the things I was very proud of during the beginning of the pandemic with my friend Gus Bilirakis of Florida, we provided flexibilities to allow the funding to cover different things: food, shelter, clothing, transportation, other essential personal needs. VA has used nearly $9 million to support over 39,000 homeless or at-risk veterans with foundational needs in the last few years, and it was very disappointing to see that Congress failed to act to extend the flexibilities on May 11th. I'm very proud to support my colleague, Rep. Sherflus McCormick's bill to make those flexibilities permanent. Assistant Secretary, for you or for the panel, can you share how those funding flexibilities were used during the public health emergency and what effect they had on veteran homelessness?
Sure, I can take that, Congressman. In our vision, we use the flexibilities to do the things you talked about, to prepay rent for veterans who are moving from homelessness into permanent housing, but also for food subsidies. We found many veterans are food challenged, and certainly were during the pandemic, and used the temporary authority to support that. Also for transportation, we set up rideshare programs across the country that were able to connect many veterans to VA health services or community resources that they needed during the pandemic, and that was tied to the temporary authorities.
Well, I would just close by saying in 2020, there were 37,252 veterans experiencing homelessness. By 2022, 33,136. I think that reduction is a direct result of some of what we did in Congress and a lot of what you all did and what folks on the ground level did. Let's continue that progress. Let's continue that momentum as we try to achieve functional zero veteran homelessness. And with that, I'll yield back.
Thank you. And Dr. Murphy, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you guys for putting this committee together. I think the overall theme really of this session in the Republican majority has been accountability. And there's nothing wrong with accountability, nothing wrong whatsoever. In some of the other committees I've been on, we bring folks forward who have not appeared before the committee for many, many years, before Congress rather, for many, many years, and all of a sudden there's accountability. Billions of dollars were spent, and billions of dollars were spent well. It was a tragedy. We were building a plane while we were flying it. Everybody knew that. But there are also guardrails as to when you're given money, this is what you're supposed to use it for. I've had to apply for medical grants, for scientific grants. You put down there exactly what you're going to spend it on, and if you don't spend it on that, it's a problem. And I think that's what we're seeing here. Some of these issues, some of these things were not spent on, and there was no paper trail, there was no accountability, and I think that's what the issue is here. If this were to occur in the private sector, I can guarantee you some people would be out of a job. And they're protected in the federal government, and this is why this committee its work is so important. So, Mr. Rokalski, let me just ask you a few questions. You actually mentioned something a few moments ago that this was alarmist. I want to follow up. What did you mean by that?
I said it sounds alarmist. What I meant was that all of these transactions go through our annual financial statement audit. We maintain a clean audit opinion. They all go through our improper payments testing. We've reduced improper payments by 76%. When we dig into these transactions, we find that they are, from an accounting standpoint, fundamentally sound. But we have more time during the improper payments testing and the financial statement audit.
All right, well, let me follow up that. I understand you do your own audits, and you believe
No,
the
we do
OIG...
not. The IG does our audit. The IG does the audit with a public accounting firm.
Okay. I believe you stated...
Same as a private company does.
I believe you've stated the OIG is mistaken in many of the errors that they found.
No, I actually 100% agree with everything they found. 100%.
Okay,
Yep.
All right, that's excellent. I'm glad that we're on the same page with that. So let me go to Mr. Missel, back to Mr. Missel. Your written testimony cites your successful efforts in trying to prevent attempts of fraud of the supplemental funds. Can you expand upon that a little bit? Tell us what was attempted to be fraud, what was going on?
Yes, we obviously were very concerned, given all the money that was coming in, about potential fraud. We have a really great group of criminal investigators that follow up on all the leads that we get. We also put out fraud alerts to give people notices of where they could be subject to fraud.
Were these fraud from veterans, or were they fraud from VA funds being spent fraudulently?
It could be from all sorts of ways. The one I mentioned in my, my opening statement about the potential $800 million fraud, that was caught because a senior VA official contacted me and say, something doesn't sound right with this transaction. The Secretary has required all VA employees to take training on working with the OIG. And I had just met with the senior official a few days before she contacted me and said, I probably wouldn't have known to contact you without getting this information. And it's
Excellent.
It's endeavors like that that really help us to identify fraud. But we really want a culture of accountability at VA. If people see something that doesn't seem right, contact us. And that's where we're able to identify a lot of the issues.
And I think that's a healthy environment. It shouldn't be a watchdog state, but it should be a healthy environment. It's not your money, it's not my money, it's the taxpayers' money. And that's what it is, and we're trying, what is the number one thing? I've cared for patients for years, is what is best for the patient. I'll just follow up with one other question. You know, when I was young, and if I had a date, which wasn't too often, but you never know, and I asked my dad for $20 to go out for pizza and a movie, and it cost me $15. He expected the $5 back, right? So, Mr. Rakalski, what are we going to do with the unspent funds?
Well, consistent with our 23 budget, we're going to spend them. We had planned for these resources. We communicated that to Congress. The appropriation took them into consideration.
For what things are now COVID, the emergency's over?
No, we were very clear. ARP was going to be used with baseline funding for all health care for this year. Some of it is COVID related. You know, it's an extension of people being sick or waiting, but all of it was going to be used for health care for this year. And that is consistent with what we told Congress and how they appropriated the funding.
See, this is where I think the last expenditure bill was way too lax in allowing too much freewheeling with what was sent. So anyway, with that, I'll yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. DeLuzio, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I've heard plenty of concerns from my Republican colleagues say about growth in the VA's budget, and I'll be pretty frank. If you didn't want to care for veterans and deal with the rising cost of that care, you shouldn't have sent us off to 20 years of war. We're going to have more cost to care for veterans because we sent people to fight at war. I also want to respond to the chairman's claims about partisan showboating around budgets. I don't think it's partisan showboating to point out that House Republicans voted to pull back $2 billion from the VA, that their own appropriations bill underfunds the Toxic Exposure Fund by nearly $15 billion. Again, if you didn't want to guarantee veterans care from burn pits and toxic exposures, you shouldn't have sent folks off to 20 years of war. I think it's a betrayal of the purpose of the PACT Act and the obligation this country has to all those who have served, many of whom are on this committee. To the topic of today, and the OIG reports and Missel's testimony in particular, I agree the need for robust oversight. What I'm not seeing is substantive reporting on the oversight of money used in the fee-for-service or community care side of the ledger. VA's received nearly $37 billion in emergency relief funding for COVID, approximately $30 billion or so spent on medical services, a fifth of which was spent on fee-for-service or community care. Mr. Missel, my question for you, sir. Costs for this program, community care, are ballooning faster than VA medical care costs. Does OIG have any insight into how these fee-for-service providers used COVID-19 relief funds?
We have not done any projects on that specific topic. We've looked at community care in a number of different projects. We have some ongoing right now. And given the future, given the increases going forward, we will continue to watch community care very closely.
Is there some legislative need to provide additional authority to have more insight into that, what spending is happening in community care?
I don't think we need any legislative authority to do the kind of oversight that I think is appropriate.
Okay. On April 18th, at a subcommittee here, Dr. Julie Kroviak from your office voiced, quote, "Our office has published reports related to community care detailing delays in diagnosis and treatment, lack of information sharing or miscommunication between providers, and significant quality of care concerns," end quote. So is there anything stopping your office from providing that same level of detail on how community care funds are spent, just as you're doing with the VA here?
No, we have the ability to look at that to the extent we can get information from community care providers or other sources.
I would urge you to do that, certainly as this is a much faster growing part of medical care cost we're seeing across the VA. Switching topics briefly to VA Video Connect and the program, Mr. Missel, would you agree that VA adapted quickly in the pandemic and that telehealth increased use of mental health services, closing gaps in veterans care?
We saw a significant increase in telehealth appointments, and I would agree that VA pivoted very quickly to meet the needs of veterans at the beginning of the pandemic.
Okay. I think, and it sounds like you agree, that VA's demonstrated having access to VHA telehealth is a benefit to veterans and healthcare, helped to reduce suicidal behavior, emergency department visits. Do you think it would make sense for telehealth to count as an access standard under the Mission Act?
I haven't looked into that specifically, but it's certainly something to consider.
Very well. Ms. Bell, anything you wanted to add to that? I saw you nodding along.
I just would like to echo the sentiment that the telehealth for our veterans in the facility and in the community on a personal level is very beneficial to their care.
Very well. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. Just before I yield to Mr. Van Orden, toxic funding is in the regular budget. Congress is funding the care needed. It is now up to the VA to appropriately use that money for all the veterans. And community care is veterans care, period, because over the time of the Choice Act, the Mission Act, we had to fight in this committee to make sure that the veterans receive their care wherever they could get it and have it be quality first, accessible second. And the VA is working with challenges, as it always has, to take, if you will, some might call an urban model that applies to a suburban model to be transitioned to a rural model, and then in some cases a remote Zoom model. But that's the future. But I would applaud the VA and the veterans for accepting new ways to get their health care, over the course of the last few years. So having said that, Mr. Van Orden, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Orkowski, how many veterans died of COVID?
I would have to take that for the record, sir. I do not
Okay,
know.
how many died with COVID?
I do not know.
Okay, how many vets got COVID in a VA facility?
I would have to take that for the record.
How many employees got COVID in a VA facility?
Same.
How many family members of veterans or employees got COVID in a VA facility?
I would have to take that for the record.
Okay, sir, these are the most basic metrics you should have showed up to this committee with. This is about whether or not your department has spent billions of dollars protected our veterans. And if you can't answer those off the top of your head, that means you are very ill prepared for this committee meeting, and that is bad. So your preparation is as shoddy as some of your accounting practices here. So I read your testimony, and quite frankly, I was not impressed with it. So I'm going to read something to you. A painful emotion caused by the awareness of having done something wrong or foolish. Do you know what that is? That is the definition of the word shame. And that's where you guys should be hanging your head right now. And a lot of people in your leadership, you should be hanging your head in shame because you have politicized your department. On April 21st, your department published a blatantly political, misleading, and disingenuous release on your website saying the Republicans are going to gut veterans' health and slash the VA budget. I would like to enter this for the record. It says we're going to cut 81,000 jobs. We're going to have 30 million fewer appointments. We're going to undermine telehealth, worsen the wait times for benefits, prevent construction of healthcare facilities, fail to honor all of our veterans, cut housing for veterans, increase food insecurity for veterans, deprive veterans of mental health, substance use, and other services, eliminate job training and other support to veterans. The secretary graciously came to our office, my office, and Mr. Luttrell and Ms. Kiggins and Mr. Crane were all there. He was explicitly clear, the Secretary of Veterans Affairs, that the Veterans Affairs is not a political organization. Do you agree with this statement?
I absolutely agree with that.
Okay, well then on May 16th, the military Milcon VA appropriations bill was released. And it proved unequivocally that everything that your department has said politically is a lie. So I ask you this. Have you issued a public statement retracting the blatant political lies that you have posted on your website as of this morning?
Have I personally? No.
Has your department?
I'm not aware of that.
Okay, you're not aware of it, and because you didn't. Why would you not do that?
Well, Mr. Van Orden, I prepared the analysis supporting that. I do not control the message, but
I know.
the analysis that
Listen,
I
we
provided
can all stand around and point
is
fingers at each
consistent
other.
with the
Listen,
analysis
dude. Hey.
that I've done every year for a continuing resolution,
Listen, unfortunately,
government shutdown, lapse in appropriation.
I got you. But unfortunately, your actions and the actions of your leadership have clearly demonstrated that you have blatantly politicized your department, and you and your leadership have done a tremendous disservice to our veterans and should be ashamed of your conduct. So your department must remove this inflammatory and inaccurate statement from your website and start a public relations campaign explaining to our vets that the VA is fully funded, including the PAC Act. You must do that. If you don't do this, you're going to be proving to the American people that you are intentionally fear-mongering with our veterans for political purposes, and that's shameful. Let me tell you why. This weekend, I was in Sparta, Wisconsin. I met Don. He's a 93-year-old Korean and Vietnam veteran, and he was scared. He was terrified because he thought he's losing all of his care because you guys decided to politicize this. So you are terrifying Don on purpose, and that's inexcusable. Don doesn't know how to get on a computer and look this up and find the appropriations bill, proving that what you said is a lie. He does not know how to do that. So do your job, sir.
You know, Mr. Van Orden, most of the requests I got for the 22% analysis came from veterans who were concerned about the cut.
Yeah? Well, it's a lie. So now you know it's wrong? You 100% know it's wrong. I know you can read, sir. So read the appropriations bill that counteracts everything in this. I'm asking you to do that. With that, I yield back.
Ms. Sherfilis McCormick, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My question is for Mr. Roshalski. The VA's Office of Information Technology was awarded $2.2 billion in CARES Act funding. Can you tell me if and how any of this funding was used to support and bolster the VA's electronic health record modernization program?
Could I refer that to Laura? Do you know specifically for EHRM?
I cannot speak to the IT portion of it. I can tell you that under the CARES Act, that we did not support EHRM, but under the ARP, there was investment in the modifications of our infrastructure to accommodate the EHRM, and details of that are in our budget.
So I'd like to take that for the record. I don't believe any CARES Act funds were used for EHRM, but I would like to confirm that.
And the investments that were made, was there any positive results from those investments?
Well, certainly the investments in our facilities, to the extent that a lot of our facilities are very, very old and never anticipated the need for server rooms and the type of infrastructure that's necessary to support a modern electronic health record. Those modifications are an essential prerequisite for us to continue the electronic health modernization, and those modifications are necessary and needed to be funded. So certainly it makes a big difference. And beyond the electronic health record, I think just in general, the other investments that have been mentioned, and I would welcome my colleague, Mr. McDivitt, to speak for a veteran-centric lens.
From a field perspective, early in the pandemic, Congresswoman, the IT infrastructure money was essential. As you heard from Mr. Missel and others, we had to move to telehealth at a rate that ended up being 2,000 times faster than we thought we would. We needed laptops, we needed IT infrastructure to support that, and it came very quickly. Same with the move when we had to move many of our employees to telework almost overnight. We were very unsure that would work, and we're provided the resources to do that. In terms of ARP money, that's allowed us to upgrade our IT infrastructure and to do many long overdue projects that will benefit veterans for decades to come, we feel.
Thank you. My next question is for Inspector General Missel. I serve as the ranking member of the Technology Modernization Subcommittee here on the Veteran Affairs Committee. Your testimony initially focused on deficiencies in IT system and business processes. The VA's current financial management system is about 30 years old and represents a significant risk to the department's operations. What would it mean for the VA to have a modern financial management system, and would modernization help the VA comply with audits and oversight?
Absolutely. And we've noted this in our audits of the financial statements, the deficiencies in the current financial management system, FMS, and that is something that is desperately needed to improve. That's not the only thing. As I noted in my testimony, there's other issues that they have to complete as well. But certainly getting a new financial management system is a big step in the right direction.
Thank you. My next question is for Ms. Bell. Your testimony mentioned staffing ratio flexibility offered to state veteran homes during public health emergencies. Since the public health emergency ended on May 11th, how are state veteran homes working to increase workforce recruitment and retention to ensure patient safety standards for our veterans?
Well, we are continuing to advertise. We are continuing to recruit. We have seen, as one of my colleagues stated earlier, in New York, an increase in CNAs applying for their CNA school. So we're starting to see people applying to these programs. Now, you can't hire if you don't have people going through the education system to get trained. So we're working with our local community colleges, universities that have those nursing program and CNA programs as well as reaching out to the VA and utilizing the nurse retention grant program.
Thank you. And my next question is also for you, Ms. Bell. Your testimony mentioned that 72% of state veteran homes receive funding from both the VA and the Medicare program and are subject to similar week-long inspection from either agency. Can you tell me how these inspections differ from each other, or if they feel redundant?
I would say that the VA survey has always been the top-notch survey for state veterans homes. I've been in the State Veterans Home Program for 23 years. It has always held the bar higher than CMS traditionally. It's also been an educational survey. So to have that VA survey on site leading into a CMS survey, we felt more prepared for the CMS survey that cannot seem as an education tool for us like VA survey. We also, to add to that oversight, some of our facilities are Joint Commission accredited as well. We also have life safety coming in, but the VA standards have always been more stringent than CMS, and we always embrace those surveys to teach us to do better for our veterans.
Thank you so much for your testimony today. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Luttrell, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning. Mr. Wachowski, how long have you been in your current position?
Going on 6 years.
6 years. Yep. Ms. Duke?
4 years.
Don't sharpen your pencil. Sir, how long have you been the IG?
I've been the IG 7 years and 19 days.
So I'm assuming this isn't the first report that you have received from the IG?
No, it's not.
Okay. Mr. Missel said reoccurring issues, accountability, breakdown in leadership, poor communication. I'm assuming that these issues have been in multiple reports that you've issued to the VA, correct, sir?
That is correct.
And Mr. Trolsky and Ms. Duke, and unfortunately, since you've been there long enough, this falls on your shoulders.
It does.
Okay, and I know the VA is a very cumbersome department, and it is a ugly machine, if you will. The IG said that...
We don't call it that around the office.
Yeah, the IG stated that the financial management system is not due to be integrated or updated correctly in this decade. So my first question to the panel is, are we to assume, given the amount of money we've lost over the past few years, for that to continue? Because the blame has been put on the management system itself. Sir.
Yeah, so the blame is not just on the management system. I mean, it's on the people, the processes as well. I would take, we're not losing money and we have sound accounting, but we don't have all of the...
It doesn't say sound accounting. It says weak accounting practices from the IG's report.
Right, it does, but I counter that with our clean audit opinion.
That's
and
a
our
large
improper
statement
payments.
from your sound accounting to weak accounting that's 180 out, sir.
Our financial statement auditor says we have sound accounting, and they're run by the IG.
So you guys aren't talking to each other.
No, I think we're talking to each other.
We both agree.
Even with our financial statement audits, we have continually found material deficiencies, significant weaknesses, and a big part of that is the internal controls.
So what are we going to do for the next 10 years, 6 years, 7 years to course correct this ship so we don't continue to lose this money? Because we up here on this panel have a very difficult job of moving money in proper places. And if we can limit the amount of fraud, waste, and abuse, it makes our jobs easier, and it's even better for the veterans. Yeah?
So we're going to continue to roll out our state-of-the-art accounting system. We're going to continue to consolidate accounting in our financial services center, and we're going to continue to train people. And we will see improvement. For example, you may have read about journal vouchers. Journal vouchers last year to this year are down 55% because of the work that we're doing.
Let's do this. The IG also said, and Ms. Duke, I think you said this too, that it's challenging in who we report to, who has a certain role and responsibility. Those break down in communications in silos, right? VA is very siloed, department to department. Who's responsible for creating roles and responsibilities, and then who's responsible for communicating that down and into the organization so you're well informed and that problem goes away? There's got to be a name.
You're looking at him right here. I am ultimately responsible.
Okay, sir, how long have you been in this position?
6 years.
That seems to be a problem, sir.
I'm not sure
Well, we just had Ms. Duke and the IG say that there's a reoccurring issue on accountability, communication, and roles and responsibilities. You say that lives on your shoulders, and you've been in that position for 6 years.
Correct. That's correct. But he also mentioned that the organizational structure is they don't report to me. I mean, it's my job to work within the organizational structure that we have. They do not work directly for me, but I'm ultimately responsible.
But if I may say, although I organizationally report to the Undersecretary of Health, I don't feel like there's a lot of daylight between myself and Mr. Rochalski regarding the expectations of financial controls, regarding our cooperation on the audit, regarding our coordination to roll FMBT out to my organization. And I work very closely with my counterparts in the VISNs and in the medical centers so that we maintain frequent communication.
Okay, well, at a leadership level, if you're saying that that's copacetic, it seems down and inside the organizations where we're misallocating $187 million as a breakdown.
What I would say is that the IG correctly identified that in certain incidences during the evolving concerns of the pandemic, which did demand a greater use and reliance on journal vouchers, we were not as ready as we could have been at the outset to provide clarifying guidance to our field, in part because we were still learning what the expectations were on the medical centers during the pandemic. But now that we've learned from that, we are clearer in the guidance that we issue to convert the guidance that we get from CFO into something that is useful and material to our financial folks out in the medical centers to adopt those practices.
I'm out of time, sir. I yield back.
Sorry.
Thank you. Ms. Brownlee, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Missel, I wanted to ask you, in your testimony this morning, you talked about the issue of oversight and transparency and the fact that medical centers are sort of independent, and that's somewhat problematic in terms of full implementation. I'm curious for your opinion, is the autonomous nature of medical centers sort of an ongoing issue when you look at oversight issues in relationship to a lot of different policies and regulations? Is that something that sort of crops up frequently?
Yes, that is a theme in a number of our reports, the decentralized nature of the governance structure. And they do benefit because a lot of healthcare is local, but there needs to be proper oversight of that, and that's where the decentralized nature sometimes fails in the oversight.
Yeah, it's a frustrating point for me because I find that I understand the benefits of working independently and so forth, but when they're not complying to policies that we have passed and become law and following the regulations, it becomes a little bit frustrating. Not a little bit, a lot frustrating. Mr. Rochalski, in terms of the IT systems and certainly the issue about the FMS system, so is Mr. Delbeni involved in the execution of completing that process at all?
He is, or his team is, yeah. In fact, we have an IT component embedded with our IFAM's program office. Mm-hmm.
And do you, do you have a time frame for when we've spent God knows how much money, billions of dollars when it comes to all of the IT systems, but in terms of this one, do you have a sense of when you'll be online?
Well, we are online. This has been, in my estimation, a real success story. We've had 5 successful implementations. We have 3,000 users. We have 99.97% availability. We've processed 3.1 million transactions. We've dispersed $9.3 billion through Treasury. There's a 96.9% IFAM satisfaction. We're going to go live with our next major implementation, which includes the IG in 3 weeks, which is why I have my resume up to date. And if you're hiring, I'd be interested in.
Well, I guess if it's
so
great.
It's on time, it's on budget, and we are proceeding. The reason it's going to take so long is we have 130 different instances of VHA we're going to have to go through. We may be able to speed it up, but it's been a real success. And I mentioned that our journal vouchers are down by 55% attributable to the IFAM's implementation.
I see. It just wasn't working to get through the supplemental issues that we had with...
VHA received the preponderance of the supplemental funding, and they do not have IFAMs yet. That's correct.
Yeah. Okay. I just want to make, for the record...
Thank you for the question. We're very proud of IFAMs. It's been a real success.
I understand, and I commend you for the success you've had so far. I'm just asking, when the entire system is going to be up to speed, and I had to kind of dig for that answer.
I'm sorry. So about 6 years.
Okay, thanks. Are you familiar at all with a bill that I've introduced, the Elizabeth Dole Community-Based Services Bill for veterans?
I have heard of it, but I'm not familiar with comment.
Simply enough, it's a bill to move away from institutionalized care into, for care for veterans who are aging, who have disabilities, et cetera, to be able to stay in their homes. And I guess, just understanding that and what its purpose is, do you believe that, A, that's sound policy from a fiscal perspective, and B, do you think it's sound policy in anticipation of another pandemic or another disaster, weather-related disaster, which we can only assume will happen?
Based on what you described, it sounds like very sound policy, yes.
Okay, thank you. And Ms. Bell, through the ARP funding, VA anticipates 12 new state veteran homes that will open in 2023 and 2024. It appears, once again, we may soon find ourselves with a backlog of state veteran home construction projects. VA's only requested $164 million for fiscal year 2024. As you noted in your testimony, once VA releases its new priority list, the actual need may be closer to $900 million. So what does that mean for veterans across the country and the timelines?
Excuse me. Even though you spoke about the Elizabeth Dole and taking care of them at home, what we see is not every veteran has family that's local. They don't have the capacity to do that. These homes are going to allow them to come in to a state veterans home to be with, as they call it, their comrades. What we've learned is some veterans in the communities plan 10 years out to go into the nearest state veterans home by then when the time comes. So they anticipate. I'm in talks right now with a veteran, and his daughter has me talking to him on a weekly basis, that this is the anticipation. We're talking about his care, his life, what happens next in that next chapter.
No, I understand. So are you developing waiting lists for these potentially 12 new state veteran homes?
They are called applicant lists in each section, and we have one in North Carolina as well, yes.
Very good. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Self. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll start this out by Chairman Boss started this out with that chart, if you remember right, and I just want to emphasize the fact that your secretary has damaged the relationship with Congress by the 22%. Let's just make no mistake about it. Of the 10K purchases or contracts that were reviewed, resulting in $187 million in mistakes, what percentage of the total purchases or contracts was that 10K? Just an order of magnitude.
I have to take that for the record. I don't know how much of that funding was spent on payroll versus contracts. I don't have those numbers before me, so
I would assume it's many times more than 10K purchases and contracts.
Yep.
Many times more. So the $187 million that we've thrown around here is probably a very small subset of what it actually is. Is that a fair statement?
It is, yes.
Okay, so the $187 million is a small subset of what actually transpired. What accountability has been held? Because there are people behind every system. I've also heard a lot about a system that's being rolled out that will help. But it doesn't matter whether you're using the old system or the new system. There are people behind every system. There is a person that is responsible. I'm also concerned about the CFOs don't have a formal chain of command relationship with other CFOs, and being a military guy, that seems to make sense to me because money is one of the things that'll get you in trouble every time. But who has been held accountable for these errors? Because again, I want to point out the $187 million is probably a very small percentage of the dollars we're talking about that were mistakenly contracted. So who's been held accountable?
Well, I would say that we all have. I mean, we take the IG report in addition to our financial statement auditing, our improper payments, and we use that to provide additional training. Obviously, if somebody has committed a crime, there's culpability for that. But most of this has to do with the individual's motivation, training, how they follow processes. So we work with them to provide remedial training. In some cases, there may be some disciplinary action if it's blatant. But I think we're all accountable for it. Yeah, I'm sorry, Rob.
Just Congressman, early in the pandemic, we set up a process to track every dollar. It was largely a manual process, as Mr. Roshalski indicated. We put audits in place. We used our usual financial management processes. We had our compliance officer audit the process to make sure that we were doing what we needed to do.
Okay, that's process-oriented. I'm talking about accountability. Now, to me, and let me go back and just make sure I understood your $800 million in non-existent PPE. Did I hear that right?
A gentleman tried to sell VA $800 million of PPE that did not exist. Fortunately, we were able to get to that person before VA contracted for that $800 million.
Very good. So when I talk about accountability, I mean demoted, reassigned, disciplined, formally disciplined, and ultimately fired. When I talk about accountability, that's what I mean. So who's been held accountable for anything?
Well, if there are any actions that warranted that, that level of intervention, we would do so. I can't speak through the entire organization. I mean, but we take actions as appropriate as we find things. If it's a matter of they weren't trained properly, that's probably on us, and we train them. If they didn't follow policies or procedures, there could be a letter of recommendation, things like that.
But you prepared, obviously, you prepared hard for a hearing before Congress about a very small percentage of transactions that were wrong at $187 million. You prepared. I know you did. And yet, that's one of the things that I think you would have been prepared to tell this committee and Congress what you've done about it. And training and processes and all is all good, but eventually, people are behind everything, and accountability means have you taken in the personnel action area to correct it? Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. Ms. Budzinski, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the panelists for being here today. As we're all very well aware, the COVID-19 pandemic has had devastating impacts across the country and affected all Americans in some way. Unfortunately, our veterans who tend to have higher chances of experiencing a disability or have morbidities, due to their unique military experiences, were one of the communities most disproportionately impacted. And as has been made clear by my colleagues in the OIG report, mistakes were made on how the VA handled supplemental funds and spending related to the pandemic. I do have a few questions on that, but I also want to take a moment to highlight the noteworthy and rapid response the VA took in the face of an unprecedented pandemic. The VA helped care for over 750,000 veterans with COVID, helped over 200,000 veteran families experiencing financial difficulties retain their homes during the pandemic, vaccinated almost 5 million veterans, and reduced veterans' homelessness by 11% between 2020 and 2022. And as made clear by Ms. Bell's testimony, VA's efforts in supplemental funding was instrumental in helping state veterans' homes sustain operations, hire new staff, and build new infection control systems. That being said, I do want to touch on a few issues, a few of the issues identified by the IG report. Mr. Rochalski, as I mentioned before, there were several issues in how funds, specifically those from the CARES Act, were used. There was a lack of accountability and transparency in how the VA directed and used funds, mainly due to the VA's outdated financial management system, which I know we've been talking about. I will highlight, as does the IG report, that the controls developed to track these expenses were developed during the pandemic when decisions had to be made rapidly in order to prioritize and utilize funds for the most pressing needs. So my question, Mr. Rochalski, given that there are still at least, I think, 500 million unspent supplemental funds, what specific steps has the VA taken to improve their financial control systems going forward and have more transparency in how these funds and other funds are used?
I would say the number one thing is we will and have provided more explicit guidance for the use of supplemental funding.
Okay. Okay, and then what lessons, Mr. Rochalski, has the VA taken from this experience to better prepare in case there is another public health emergency?
I'm going to ask Robert to answer that. He's kind of at the tip of the spear, and I think his experiences are probably the most relevant.
Sure. Thank you, Congressman. The lessons from COVID are many. I think the main one is that we are able to respond as a system. I have 8 states in my network, 8 medical centers, 62 community-based outpatient clinics. All of them remained open and operating every day during the pandemic. We made sure that veterans were safe and well cared for. We made sure that employees were safe. We were able to support caregivers. We were able to reach out to community partners, including state veterans homes, as Ms. Bell noted, in the state of Iowa and in Minnesota, where I live. We really focused on the system nature of the VA, that I operate a large integrated regional healthcare system. We moved resources where they needed to be, whether it be within my network or around the country. And we functioned for the first time in my long VA career as a fully integrated national system. And that's a lesson that we'll take into the next challenge, whether it be a pandemic or something else.
Okay, thank you. My next question to the panel, the Limit, Save, Grow Act, if passed in the Senate, would rescind critical supplemental funding. This is funding we have right now, which is urgently needed by our veterans across the country, specifically veterans in my rural district that I represent in central and southern Illinois, where we can build upon our community care partnerships as well as on telehealth. 2 of my top priorities. Could you share some of your insights on what negative impacts do you anticipate in rural healthcare services if this $500 million were to be rescinded? On the other side, what are some ways that funding could be utilized to promote rural veteran care?
Thank you for the question. I think that as is clear in our budget, we are always focusing resources on the unique needs of our rural health population. And because we anticipated having the ARP funding in conjunction with our base funding, any interruption in that would interfere with our plans. In terms of our investment for rural health care, as you know, we are continuing to make our significant investments in telehealth. We are continuing to expand our community partnerships for those to receive community care, and we are just continuing to utilize the best ways that we've found to reach our rural veterans and respond to their unique needs.
Might I add that from the State Veterans Home perspective, to take the time to get a veteran up out of bed and put him on a van and transport him, he or she, for 2.5 hours one way to an appointment and back to the facility, making it an 8-hour day, telehealth would be so much more convenient for their quality of life and the care that they receive.
Thank you. I agree. I yield back, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Mr. Rosendale, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I really appreciate that. Mr. Rochalski, I had a whole line of questioning here that was in regards to the blatant lies that you put out in your press release on the Veterans Affairs website. But my colleague, Mr. Representative Van Orden, did such an excellent job at exposing it and his condemnation of the same. You're not going to need the button for a couple of minutes, so just relax.
Okay.
This is my turn.
Okay.
This is my turn. His condemnation of the way that you put that information out and the way that you have left it out there, scaring veterans, is an embarrassment, quite frankly. What I would like to make sure everybody's aware of, I've been doing a little bit of digging around while we had this additional time. The 2022 enacted funds for the Veterans Administration was $273.9 billion. The increase, not including ARP, to 2023 was $34.6 billion, a 12.6% increase is what the veterans were able to have utilized to provide them benefits. You, sir, did a poor job of making sure that that money was utilized to deliver benefits. Those are the realities. You had another $4.3 billion that was allocated through ARP, and you've squandered $3.8 billion of that. And now you've got $500 million that is still not spent. So we're still talking about a total of $38.4 billion that the Veterans Administration has spent more from 22 during the fiscal 23 year. And there's $500 million that has not been used that you don't feel we should be redirecting and utilizing for other purposes, whether it's to deliver real benefits to the veterans or to help the Treasury pay the bills. That is what this room finds unacceptable. I will tell you that. And as you sit there and you brag with your snide remarks about the improper payment rates that you have improved so dramatically by 76%, which is, oh, by the way, since 2017, not since 22, since 2017. That sounds like a big number, but percentages you can't put in the bank. What you can put in the bank is dollars. And that was based upon, as Representative Keith was talking about, what it was talking about, or Representative Self, you started with $12.74 billion. So we still have improper payment on $509 million. Most people in this room find that to be an extremely large number still. So please do not sit there and take credit for dramatic improvements. As we've already demonstrated, you've been there for 6.5 years and you're cleaning up your resume. I would as well. I would as well. And I would hope that there weren't many people out in television land listening to your prior performance, because I don't think a line will be forming to pick up that resume. Let me ask you about an example from the OIG report on page 8. A medical facility did an expenditure transfer totaling $714,000 for nurses' salaries. That's a perfectly valid way to spend COVID supplemental funds. The problem is, when the OIG asked for the documentation showing how much money was actually paid out and who approved it, the VA had nothing. Their response was the person who processed it retired. So they don't have any of the documents. This is no way to run a business or an agency. Polish up the resume, Mr. Ryszewski. Were you able to establish whether the $714,235 or a different amount was paid out?
I have not looked in that specific case yet, no.
The COVID-19 pandemic has long been over. President Biden even recognized this reality by signing H.J. Resolution 7, which terminates the National Emergency Declaration. Despite this, the Montana VA is still enforcing an unscientific mask mandate. The Montana VA is still denying veterans care over their unwillingness to wear a mask. How many veterans have had their care delayed or denied as a result of this arbitrary mandate?
I do not know, sir.
How much has the VA spent implementing and enforcing this mask mandate?
Take that for the record.
The mandate is the exact opposite of what the supplemental funds were intended to support. Do you think it's better to use the funds to enforce a senseless mask mandate than it is to actually use those delivering health care to our nation's heroes?
That's out of my lane. That's a healthcare question, sir.
Mr. Chair, thank you so much. I yield back.
Thank you. Congresswoman Ramirez, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman and Ranking Member Takano. I really appreciate that we're holding today's hearing. I additionally want to express many thanks to every one of the witnesses for joining us today and engaging in a very critical and lively discussion today. So we've been talking about COVID-19 and the pandemic. And during the public health emergency, the Department of Veteran Affairs homeless programs acted quickly to bring veterans indoors and to decongregate shelters to reduce the spread of COVID-19. The VA utilized funding to pay for hotel and motel stays for veterans experiencing homelessness to enhance housing navigation resources. So this question is for the gentleman of the hour here, Mr. Ryszewski? I got it correct? Okay.
Call me John, yeah.
I'm big on honoring people's name. Delia Ramirez, and you're Mr. Ryszewski. How did the use of COVID funding in this way streamline VA's ability to move veterans into permanent, stable housing during the pandemic?
I wonder, Robert, you want to probably more on-the-ground experience than I do?
Thank you for your question, Congresswoman. In answer, it was very helpful. As I indicated, across our vision, we were able to quickly move veterans out of congregate housing into hotels, motels, other more secure places. We were able to utilize the funding for transportation of veterans to get them to appointments or to other things they needed. We were able to address food insecurity issues with some of that funding with homeless veterans. So clearly there was a benefit to veterans and to homeless veterans in particular from that.
Thank you, Robert. And I know, Ms. Duke, in the conversation with Congressman Levin, we talked a lot about homelessness and the impact of some of these resources and helping drop that number. He mentioned we were at about 37,200 and something people experiencing homelessness, and that number has dropped to 33,000. And I couldn't catch the last number of it. But you had also indicated, as we talked about some of the funding that you have for this upcoming budget, a real commitment to continue to reduce that number in the 24-25 budget. Tell me a little bit of the projected goals you have around the reduction of homelessness for our veterans.
Thank you. So in addition, I would say the core of our homeless is our coordination with Housing and Urban Development. So we continue to provide support services for their HUD-VASH vouchers to ensure that those vouchers are utilized and that veterans are connected with them. We are continuing to make investments in providing telehealth to homeless veterans, whether through devices, but to make sure that they're able to meet their appointments. We are, as we've mentioned, working with you all on which of the authorities that were extended under the public health emergency that make sense outside of a public health emergency to continue to reach those veterans and enable us to utilize those dollars for investments that are what veterans really need.
Great. Thank you, Ms. Duke. And I know that Throughout the hearing today, we've heard a lot about how the pandemic has ended and how we are no longer impacted in a real way around COVID-19. We also know, however, that long-term effects of COVID, otherwise known as long COVID, are still being studied. So this question could be for Mr. Richalski or any of you. Will you tell me how the VA would use COVID-19 supplemental funding for research efforts on long COVID? Before you answer specifically, I'm interested in knowing how it's affecting the underserved veteran populations and what mechanisms the VA has created to stay on top of changing variants.
So I'd like to take for the record specific investment in underserved populations, but I can say that we did utilize ARP resources to add on to our already robust base medical and prosthetic research investment with a specific focus on what we could learn about the COVID pandemic. We are continuing to track veterans who experienced COVID to learn better about long COVID. We are utilizing the lessons that were learned in terms of preventing any contagion, not just COVID, from spreading throughout our facilities.
Thank you. And this is a final question to Mr. Richalski. We've talked a lot about the budget and any cuts to the budget. So quick question, yes or no. Any cuts to the VA budget, would it result cuts to veterans? Absolutely. Any cuts to the budget, would it impact housing services, food security for veterans? That's what I figured. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Crane, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate you guys being here today. Let's start with Mr. Richelski. Sir, do you know what percentage of the VA budget is spent on mental health care for our veterans?
Percent-wise, I'd have to do the math, I'm sorry.
Could you give me even a ballpark? Anybody up here? I mean, that's a pretty broad question.
On the delivery of care, it's upwards of $10 billion.
$10 billion? Yeah. I asked for a percentage. Do you have any idea?
Of the overall VA budget?
Yep.
It depends on what the denominator is. I take it for the record to give you an exact percent.
You what?
I would take it for the record to get you an exact percent.
Okay. Next question. Is anybody on the panel, does anyone believe that betrayal, humiliation can lead to depression and poor health care for our nation's veterans? Anybody at all? I see you shaking your head, Mr. McDivitt. Betrayal, humiliation, can that lead to depression, poor health care for our nation's veterans?
Yeah, I'm not a clinician, Congressman, so I can't comment on that definitively.
Do you have common sense, Mr. McDivitt?
I can say that a significant amount of our care is provided for mental health, and that's certainly the case in our vision, where between, depending on the facility, 15 and 25% of veterans are receiving mental health services.
Yep. Do you think that betrayal, humiliation might be a part of that mental health?
Yeah, again, I can't comment on that.
Anybody at all? What about you, Ms. Bell? Does that sound like something that might cause mental health issues in our veterans?
Our veterans are very outspoken, and they have to be able to trust their caregivers. So we have to develop and cultivate that, and when we don't, there are bad outcomes, yes.
All right, that's not what I asked. Are any of you guys aware that 73% of our Afghanistan veterans feel betrayed right now? About 67% feel humiliated because of our withdrawal from Afghanistan. I mean, you guys are Veterans Affairs, right? Any of you guys aware of the Brookings Institute survey that came out in November 2021, stating that 73% of our nation's veterans feel betrayed, 67% feel humiliated? No one's aware of that? It's kind of problematic. Well, I can guarantee you, because of that, the findings of that survey, and just common sense, that's costing the American taxpayer a lot of money. Knowing that, and since none of you guys even knew it, I'm gonna ask the follow-up question anyway, so I can look at more blank stares. You think this president, commander-in-chief, should own any of the impact and cost on our veterans' health care? and the tax dollars that are going to have to be spent because of their decreasing health care because they feel depressed, humiliated, and betrayed? Does anyone think that the commander-in-chief should take any ownership of that whatsoever? Great. More crickets. You know, Mr. Rychalski, I'm gonna double tap on something that my colleague, Mr. Van Orden, and Mr. Self were pushing on. The Secretary of the VA has done tremendous amount of damage with the relationship with not only Congress, but also to our nation's veterans by lying to them about our spending cuts and our spending package. And I want to go through some stuff with you because I was in many of the conversations that were going over that, sir. The Republicans were actually trying to target our cuts towards, and go ahead, feel free to take notes since I don't think that you're aware of this based on some of your previous testimony. We're going after the RAINS Act. Are you familiar with what that is, sir?
I'm not.
Okay. IRS agents, the funding for the 87,000 IRS agents, doubling that. Yeah, we were going after that. We also went after student loan bailouts. We don't think that the American taxpayer should have to pay for everybody that, applies for a student loan. Also, the Inflation Reduction Act, also known as the Green New Deal Light, we're going after that as well. We don't think that American taxpayers should have to be funding the destruction of our energy dependence in this country. So the reason I say that is because our cuts are actually very targeted. Not once did anybody in this conference, any Republican, in any phone call that I was on, in any meeting that I was ever at, say anything about cutting veteran health care. But you all took it upon yourself to play political games. And you might have thought it was effective initially because you stirred veterans up. Congratulations. Congratulations, you did. But I'll tell you what you really did. You destroyed your integrity. And you're going to see that come appropriations time where we don't cut anything. You guys will be proved once again to be dishonest and misleading. Thank you. I yield back my time.
Mr. Mervan, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Missel, one of the recommendations your office made to the Undersecretary for Health is to establish guidance to support the amounts identified in the manual journal vouchers. Is the issue with the guidance and the standards for these manual journal vouchers limited to expenditure of the supplemental funds?
They would be with respect to this report, but we have seen the lack of guidance in many other situations.
Okay. Is there any reason to consider the age of the financial management system and why the VHA would not already have guidance and standards in place before the pandemic for these vouchers?
So given the limitations of the financial management system, you would hope that there would be guidance, clear policies and procedures, clear understandings of roles and responsibilities, just because of the limitations that the financial management system has.
Okay. And if you could, from my own knowledge, redefine limitations for me.
Some of the transactions were not able to be put through the system. They had to be done manually. Anytime you have manual transactions, you have a greater risk that they're not going to be done correctly and that you open it up to potential fraud.
Okay. Who is the accountable official responsible for issuing this guidance at the VA and the VHA specifically?
It's my responsibility to communicate the guidance from John's office to the VHA.
Okay. Is this issue enhanced by the fact that VAMCs are well known to operate as unique entities?
I would say that that is definitely part of the challenge, but in this particular case, I think it was that the VAMCs were responding to the pandemic. And since our primary focus was keeping veterans and our staff members safe, we were sometimes operating under less than ideal staffing circumstances.
Okay. Has your office provided any recommendations for addressing lack of guidance and standardization being decimated from VA headquarters to the medical centers?
We are in the process of improving our processes consistent with the recommendations that the IG made in the report. For my office, that is the responsibility of standardizing the guidance And then we are working collectively with the Office of Integrity and Compliance within VHA that is responsible for going out into the field and ensuring that roles and responsibilities are followed appropriately. And I don't know if Mr. McDivitt wants to add.
That was certainly one of the lessons learned from the pandemic for us, Congressman, working with Ms. Duke's office. My CFO is working with medical centers, CFOs, to standardize processes. We endeavored to do that. I can say the things that we did as an integrated system throughout the pandemic were much easier to track and account for than the things where we did journal vouchers and things of that nature, although we endeavored to manually keep track of that as well. So we have changed processes.
Mr. Missel, your report recommends that the VHA staff segregate duties, make certain that a purchase card holder is not the requester and approver, and ensure that contracting officers, representatives, or cores know and understand their duties and responsibilities for these certifications and payments of invoices. These recommendations seem to me to be something that VA should have already been doing. This is pretty basic stuff. Are you surprised that your office is having to make these recommendations to VA?
We agree that these are basic responsibilities or sort of fundamental to good internal controls, and those recommendations remain open.
Okay. I'm assuming that supplemental funds and the pandemic are not just highlighted issues that have been at VA for years. Why is there not a process in place to train and educate contracting and purchasing staff on these basic roles?
There is, and you're right, those are basic functions, and we have to test it and provide remedial training, sometimes disciplinary action. You're 100% correct. Yep, it's variability across the system that we continually try to fix.
But I would say during the pandemic, the increased reliance on journal vouchers, because when we receive supplemental funding, what is automated is no longer able to be taken advantage of. So we were it was highlighting a challenge that we were already aware of and making it more urgent.
And keep in mind, during the pandemic, we have acquisition people working 24 hours a day trying to acquire supplies and equipment. We had financial management staff that were repurposed to take temperature at the front door of VAMC. So it was a very different situation.
Okay. With that, I yield back, Chairman.
Gentleman yields back. Representative Mace, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank the ranking member as well, and I want to thank General Bergman for letting me slide in here to ask a few questions before I have to leave today. I wanted to take a moment also and thank the VA Appropriations Committee for writing their bill, which fully funds the Department of Veterans Affairs, despite the continued comments from the administration and from the left that Republicans don't want to fund or want to cut funding from veterans. Nothing could be further from the truth. And some of you up here today have participated in a bed of lies, bullshit and lies regarding the debt ceiling. And quite frankly, it's extremely disrespectful to our veterans to posit or even to accuse us of wanting to cut VA benefits. None of us up here on the left or the right, Democrats or Republicans, want to do that. We are concerned about the lack of accountability, waste, fraud, and abuse within the VA. I am also concerned with that enormously. And looking at the COVID supplemental funding, as we've been discussing today, the fraud and abuse, and that is appalling. The VA received roughly $40 billion in extra funding between 2020 and 2021. When the OIG audited $14.5 billion of the money, the OIG found the record keeping was usually incomplete. It was not signed. There were a lack of descriptions of purpose, no documentation, in some cases none at all existed. So I have a few questions this morning. Mr. Missel, my first one is for you. Did your report say the VA struggled to account for CARES funds, failing to maintain audit trails for majority of internal transfers, failed to adhere to internal controls, and 10,000 plus supply purchases or service contracts worth over 187 million, yes or no?
Yes.
Thank you. Mr. Roszowski, would you consider not being able to account for $187 million fraud, waste, and abuse?
I would not.
I'm sorry. So if I gave you $187 million and you didn't know what to do with it, you wouldn't call that waste?
No, unless it's proven as fraud, waste, and abuse. It could just be the fact you didn't have a receipt, but when you look farther, which we have, and we find the receipt.
So okay. So In Mr. Missel's report, that they couldn't find, they didn't have information on $187 million. So if you just spend that money and you don't have the receipts, you would not call it waste. I don't know how you have your job, quite frankly, if that's your position. Based on that example, do you think that the VA has any issues with waste, fraud, and abuse?
We absolutely do. Yes, we do.
And where would that be?
It's across the system, and we work very diligently to root it out.
But
But
just-
there's a difference between fraud, waste, and abuse and not having a receipt or an accounting anomaly or a journal voucher. There's a big difference between those.
Yeah, I would say if you spent $187 million, you know where it went, that was definitely waste, fraud, and abuse, and so would the American taxpayer, and so would our veterans. Do you think $187 million could have helped veterans if you knew what it was actually spent on?
I know it was spent on veterans, so I think it did help them.
Yeah, I would disagree with your position on that. This hearing's findings reveal a troubling lack of oversight. I've heard my colleagues on our side of the aisle talk about that lack of internal controls within the VA and inability to adequately document transfers of funds. You say you have the receipts, but Mr. Missel's report says otherwise. Lack of adherence to fiscal controls are clear indicators of a system that's in disarray. These shortcomings can't be ignored as they've been a result of the inability for the VA to account for significant sums of money. We have many veterans on our committee today, and I concur and agree with the frustration that they have. Almost every one of my family members has either been through the VA or will be in their future, because almost all of them have served, and they deserve so much better than what they're getting today, particularly with the chip that you have on your shoulder and your testimony before this committee. Maybe leave it at the door next time. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and any extra time I have, I will yield to General Bergman. Thank you, and I yield back.
General Bergman, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you for the lady for yielding, because then I'll consume as much time as the chairman will allow. Bad news doesn't get better with time. That's a fact. So let's start with a little trivia question here. Anybody here in this room know who the Army Corps of Engineers reports to? No one. So when you think about, why would I start at a Veterans Affairs Committee hearing with that statement? When you are an entity that may be good folks working hard in that entity who is not accountable to any entity or person above you, you have a natural tendency to make life about you and your priorities. I chose to speak last here today, if you will. The chairman accepted here for closing remarks. But having had the gavel on the Oversight Subcommittee during the 115th Congress, I've heard a different level of BS today that was more convincing than I've heard in a long time from some of you. Now, I would just, don't you think, according to one of the questions where who responded, Mr. Wachowski, as far as the veterans reaching out about, they were reaching out to you all about the cuts, don't you think maybe we'd have cut down or maybe eliminated that outreach if we hadn't lied to them on the front end about the 22% cuts in the Limit Save Grow Act, which we know is not true, never has been, never will be. You've got a lot of members of this committee, both sides of the aisle, who've put their country first before anything else. That's not a core competency of any bureaucracy, any bureaucracy. We need not only accountability, we need you to just flat out be truthful with us, okay? That's all we're asking for. Because while you may not report to us, in the end, we all report to the veterans. Us as elected members of Congress, you as people work within a system that has the arguably second largest bureaucracy in the federal government, second only to DOD. And guess what, where those veterans come from? They come from being fed a line of baloney, sometimes within the DOD during their service. So they get a little tired of being, I'm not gonna say lied to, but just being pushed sideways for the wrong reasons. So, let me Let me ask you a question. Mr. Missel, I'd rather ask questions than talk, but I felt compelled to speak after hearing this. Could you, going back to who reports to who, could you repeat your statement regarding who doesn't report to who within the VA? Did I get right that you made a couple of comments about lack of reporting?
Yes, I did. So within the VA financial management structure, Mr. Richalski is the CFO of VA. However, the line CFOs from VHA, which is Ms. Duke, VBA, and NCA do not report to Mr. Richalski. Similarly, under Ms. Duke within VHA, while she is the CFO of VHA, the CFOs of the divisions, the CFOs of the medical centers do not report up to her.
You know, when I first started looking at, and this is before being elected to Congress, the VISN system, I wondered how it would, worked, being VISNs having a lot of independent ability to do their business. At first, I was a little concerned that that may be a bad thing, but I would suggest to you that what I've seen over the last 6+ years is that a healthy VISN competition to see which VISN can do things better so that the other VISNs can advance the end product for the veteran. So I'm not proposing at all changing the VISN system, but I also believe that under the leadership of the VA, and I don't know if any secretary of the VA can do that, whether it was Secretary Wilkie, now Secretary McDonough, their biggest concern in knowing both of them is the veterans, but their also concern is they understand the lack of responsive nature of the bureaucracy. I'll just close by saying, stop trying to feed us a line up here. We're eventually going to find out, and it's not going to be pretty for you, but it's going to be good for the veterans. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Bergman. Representative Siscomani, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Richalski, the Department of Veteran Affairs has continually received record high annual appropriations. I sit on the Appropriations Committee, and in fact, House Republicans just published their Milcon VA appropriations bill, which not only meets the administration's request, but it provided an $18 billion increase from the previous year. Let me repeat that. It includes an $18 billion increase from fiscal year 2023 numbers, which shows Republicans' commitment to veterans, in spite of the misleading and irresponsible statements from Secretary McDonough, which impacted our veterans more than anyone. So I think we can all agree that our veterans deserve access to all the resources and benefits that they have earned. Now, in my community of Tucson, we are home to the Tucson VA Medical Center, and I consistently hear from my constituents about the high-quality care they received, and I'm all for maintaining our medical centers well-funded. Now, in light of the continual high levels of regular appropriations, could you please explain to me why the VA needs to spend the remaining supplemental funding set aside for COVID-19 related purposes when the COVID-19 public health emergency is now over, especially non-recurring maintenance projects that you're not able to execute by the end of the year?
I can, because it was never set aside for COVID. ARP was general purpose funds. We explained that with the budget for 23. It was part of the total funding package to provide care to veterans. You might as well just take the base funding. I mean, there's no difference. It's the same funding for this year.
What amount are you looking at right now?
Pardon me?
What is the amount that we're talking about?
500 million left in ARP, but it's the same as base funding, and that's what we had. We communicated to Congress. They appropriated the funds, knowing that we had that money, that we were going to use that money for veterans this year. There was no difference between the two. It's not set aside for COVID.
You're telling me that that money was not set aside for COVID-related purposes?
It was not appropriated specifically for COVID. It was not set aside for COVID, and we made very clear, and Congress knew that, and they appropriated the funds this year.
And can you tell me where the misunderstanding comes from? Why is this the common notion and knowledge about these funds?
Well, it's in the appropriation law, sir.
Expand on that.
I'll send you the appropriation law. You can read that it does not say it specifically for COVID. It's based on statute for health care.
Now, in the OIG report stated by Veterans Health Administration, quote, needed to establish a method of tracking and accounting for COVID-19 related costs. It's a quote.
Correct.
And the agency developed multiple memos, alerts, and questions and answer documents, but none of these documents addressed oversight of transaction processing. Also in the report, it states that, quote, the OIG estimated that in 93% of the transactions, documentation of the medical facility staff's authority to make COVID-19 related purchases was missing. I understand you have your own audits, and I see that under Secretary of Health concurred with one of the recommendations in the OIG report to require medical facility staff have documented authority through proper delegation to make purchases. Can you explain how you will implement this and make sure all transactions are documented? And can we expect these recommendations to be implemented with the remaining American Rescue Plan funds?
Yeah, I think I'm going to refer to Ms. Duke. I think 8 of those recommendations were for VHA and for their implementation at the field.
Yes, and so what I would say is we are in the process of creating clarified guidance, not just for the ARP, but for all of our journal voucher transactions to ensure that the field is well aware of the expectations of clarifying the purpose. And then we are in conjunction with our Office of Integrity and Compliance working on the oversight procedures that they will utilize to go out and ensure that those procedures are being followed throughout our enterprise.
Thank you for that. Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Takano, can you be recognized for closing remarks?
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm glad that Representative Bergman raised the issue of how different leaders within the VA report to the CFO, and I just want to point out that our bill, I think, proposes a solution to the reporting issue by creating an undersecretary level position on management. I certainly am frustrated by the elements within the IG's report related to the transparency or the lack of transparency due to the continued intensive use on the manual nature of our transactions. I hope that VA, and I want to send a message that VA does need to implement the new financial management system faster than they've announced, and that's very important. But, Mr. Chairman, I also want to respond, I think, to the charge that the VA has been politicized by so-called falsehoods and lies surrounding the Limit, Save, and Grow Act of 2023, which every Republican on this committee voted for, which is in reality the Default on America Act. During its passage, the majority created a nexus between raising the debt limit, which is about paying America's already incurred bills, and the appropriations process. They should be completely separate things. The debt limit should be the debt limit, and we should not question our ability or question whether or not we're going to pay those bills. And it should not be used as leverage in order to determine the spending priorities or policies of this Congress. That has always been negotiated. And there should be a compromise. Each side should be able to weigh into that process. But it should not be an all or nothing proposal or proposition that we get everything we want because we're going to threaten not to pay America's bills. That is just simply wrong. It's unreasonable and it is extreme. At the time of the passage, the majority laid out the principle of 22% cuts across the discretionary spending in our country. That amounts to about $142 billion. $142 billion is one estimate, what that means. So the majority is saying we're going to cut $142 billion. And at the time that the bill was moving through the House, nowhere in that bill, nowhere in the Default on America Act, was there any protection for VA spending. That, at the time, we provided the analysis. So VA helped us with the analysis. They had an analysis. We had analysis coming out of our appropriators, the Democratic appropriators, that would mean a $30 billion cut. And that is where we get the 30 million outpatient appointments that would disappear and be cut. At a time when we are trying to meet 3.5 million newly eligible veterans for health care in the PACT Act. 3.5 newly eligible. And the president said, we're not going to phase in these eligibilities, we're going to do it all at once. What was mentioned is that, well, let me just finish my train of thought here. Also at the time of the majority, they laid out at the time of passage of the bill, the majority laid out the principle of a 22% cut to discretionary spending, which amounts to about $142 billion, making no protections for VA spending, even as, in order to get the votes to pass the bill, there was language written to the bill to protect ethanol subsidies. So ethanol subsidies were important enough to protect in language, but no language in this bill was written in to protect the VA budget, which is the second largest federal department. Only after attention was called to the logic of the 22% cuts to the discretionary budget and the impact on VA's budget did Republican appropriators produce a Milcon VA mark to fund the TEF at $5.5 billion, and as was said, the overall VA budget was about $80 million more. But let us remember that the 3.5 million veterans, the VA says in order to be able to actually take care of the spending necessary to take care of toxic exposed veterans, that they need $15 billion. So $5.5 billion versus 15, that seems like a big hole in terms of underfunding the VA. So the majority now believes that the Milcon VA mark is a successful jujitsu move that proves that they have protected veterans from their share of the $142 billion cut. But what's not been laid out is how much is going to be cut from defense, or is defense going to be held harmless? There is, I think, a very difficult situation, as evidenced today by the fact that 4 subcommittees on appropriations have canceled their markups today. Because they can't figure out, well, if you're going to give VA this much money, how much is going to be allocated to labor HHS and transportation, and also defense? So if you're going to hold defense and VA harmless, let's think about what those cuts are going to mean to these other categories of spending. And mark my word, veterans are going to be harmed if we cut Medicaid to the tune that the logic of their cuts would mean. Veterans are going to be hurt when HUD VASH vouchers aren't available so we can house homeless veterans. And by the way, all this talk about unspent Inflation Reduction Act money, or unspent American Rescue Plan money, the $500 million of unspent American Rescue Plan money. I want to just remind the committee again that there was never a link to the public health emergency and the American Rescue Plan funding. And indeed, this notion that these two things be tied together is being reinforced by an extreme logic. And that extreme logic is being played out in the fact that this committee could not find the will in the majority to renew or extend authorities that reduced veteran homelessness by 11%. And why? Because it's got to fit into this ideology that all this unspent money is going to be clawed back and is part of this limit, save, grow logic. Meanwhile, who is paying the price for that? Who's paying the price for that are the homeless veterans that we can still take off the streets. Who's paying the price for that is our Americans all across the country who don't want to see veterans homeless. And we're talking about $6 million that we could have together worked on to find a solution for. So, look, the Milcon VA mark is not a settled matter. It's not as if that is the truth, because we have no visibility into what the other 11 subcommittees and appropriations have got to do in order to meet this $142 billion cut. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
I thank the gentleman for yielding, the ranking member. So let me go through a few things and correct a few things. One, the situation as far as when the floor debated the Save Grow Act, we already had in record a letter from the appropriators, the chairwoman of the appropriation, that VA would not be cut. So to say that you didn't know at that time, then apparently either staff or someone didn't pay attention, because then also I spoke on the floor as the chairman of this committee saying it would not be cut. Now, to say that that VA has not been used as a political tool, you need to talk to all the veterans who were scared to death by the piece of paper they put out saying what a 22% cut would do, even though we knew that there wasn't going to be a 22% cut. So you've been used as a political tool, whether you want to admit that or not. We are in support of trying to take care of our homeless veterans. We are in support of PACT Act. We are in support of those things, and the budget that came out yesterday proves that. Now, in response to why there are not budget meetings going on now, it's because there's a negotiation between the President of this United States and the Speaker of the House of this United States. Because when we come together to work on a budget, we need a bottom line. We do not have a bottom line, and that's the normal process. When the three get together, the Senate, the House, and the President, this is the process. To act like that process is not part of it, and that's why they're not meeting right now, is because until we get that bottom line, we don't know where we're negotiating from. You are right in the fact that the debt limit is a separate thing, but the thing is, and I think it explains best whenever we say that a debt limit is similar to whenever you've sent your child off to college and they've maxed out the credit card. And when they maxed out the credit card, you got two choices. One, you got to pay it. That's not an option. You got to pay it. Or you just look at your child and go, hey, just keep spending like that, it'll be fine. Or you can finally get somebody to the table with your child and go, hey, you're going to stop this spending. So that's what we're in the middle of negotiating and doing. But I've got another concern with the VA, and I'm not even going to ask for an answer, but I'm going to tell you how this sounds. When you explain that you don't think that the COVID money was specifically directed towards COVID and you could spend it anywhere you want. Well, let me tell you the problem that exists with that. If you can remember, the first COVID bill was $60 million. And that was the response, quick response. And then we came back with the CARES Act, and that was 19.6. Now let's put in perspective what exactly happened before this committee in November of 2020. In November of 2020, we had lost the majority of the Republican side, and the president was switching over to President Biden. We asked, in November or early December, the VA to come before this committee. They did. And we said, how much money of the CARES Act is still available, and are you okay? And the answer was $10 billion. Yes, we're fine. We don't need any more. We don't need any more. That's exactly what we said. It was said before this committee. Then we come forward. We did not need the extra $17 billion, but by golly, we pumped $17 billion more into a program that didn't have the controls that were necessary and should have had controls that was necessary. And now you tell us, no, we can really spend that any way we want. Well, let me tell you, this bothered me when you said that, because the chairman, or the secretary came before us a few months ago, and we asked, both myself and the ranking member asked, Why in the world would you use the TIF money for construction? And the answer was, because you gave us the authority to. People, you need to understand, we've got to be responsible. Both sides of the aisle. And just to come in, this is why people are so frustrated with bureaucracy. Because you can't see the common sense of saving and being sensible. And a lot of those things that you're talking about providing for don't provide squat for the veterans. They provide a lot for the agency, but they don't provide squat for the veteran. And have you come before us and then all of a sudden ask, oh, we're doing exactly what we're supposed to be doing. No, you've got to be accountable. And our job is to make you accountable. Now, I appreciate the opportunity for you guys to come in here today, but I'm going to tell you this. This is all demonstrated that we should continue to closely examine everything you do. We need to make sure that the money is being spent wisely. And you can say it's a paperwork error, you can say whatever, but that's why we have oversight. And the taxpayers require us to do that. And I'm no offense to the sailors, but the last 3 years during COVID, we've spent money like drunken sailors. And the oversight has not occurred. And it is going to occur. And we need to make sure that that oversight is there, and we're going to continue to do that. With that, I want to thank everyone for being here. And we will continue with these hearings, and we will find out and watch closely on how the money is spent. But also put down very, very clearly, we will not cut benefits to our veterans, but we will make sure that you're very, very wise in how you're spending that money. Meeting's adjourned.